I never considered myself confrontational. In fact, I prided myself on being the kind of neighbor who would lend you a cup of sugar without hesitation, help jumpstart your car in freezing weather, or collect your packages when you're out of town. That all changed when Patricia Harrington moved into the house across from mine and was immediately elected to the Pinecrest Meadows HOA board, subsequently appointing herself the Architectural Compliance Officer. My name is Daniel Calloway, a 42-year-old civil engineer who bought my modest but comfortable home in Pinecrest Meadows 5 years ago. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, with neighbors who respected each other's property and privacy. The HOA existed primarily to maintain the community pool and organize the occasional block party, until Patricia arrived and decided it needed a stronger enforcement presence. I first encountered Patricia during the annual neighborhood barbecue. She made a beeline for me after learning I was the owner of the gray house with the detached garage. "Mr. Calloway," she said, not bothering with pleasantries, "I've been reviewing the architectural guidelines, and I've noticed your garage doesn't conform to the approved designs for our community." I paused mid-bite into my hamburger. "Excuse me?" "That garage was here when I bought the house. It's been there for at least 20 years. Patricia's perfectly coiffed blonde hair didn't move an inch as she shook her head disapprovingly. "That may be true, but it was clearly built without proper approval. The setback from your property line is insufficient, and the roof line doesn't match your home's architectural style. These are serious violations." I looked over at my perfectly serviceable, 2-car detached garage. It was well maintained, recently painted to match my house, and had never raised an eyebrow in the 5 years I'd lived there, or apparently in the 15 years before that. "The previous owners got it approved back in 2001, I said calmly. "I have the paperwork in my home office if you'd like to see it." Patricia's thin-lipped smile tightened further. "The guidelines have been updated since then, Mr. Calloway. Existing structures are not grandfathered in when they present such obvious aesthetic issues. I'll be sending you a formal notice. You'll have 90 days to bring it into compliance or remove it entirely." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, clipboard in hand, presumably to inform some other unsuspecting neighbor of their violations. I stood there, hamburger cooling in my hand, wondering what had just happened. 2 days later, a bright red envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was an official-looking notice of architectural violation, with photos of my garage circled in red marker. The notice claimed my garage violated no fewer than 7 current guidelines, including being 4 inches too tall, having a roof pitch that was 2 degrees too shallow, and most absurdly, featuring gutters that were an unapproved shade of white. At the bottom of the notice, in bold type, "Homeowner has 90 days to remedy all violations or remove the structure entirely. Failure to comply will result in fines of $100 per day and possible legal action." This had to be some kind of joke. I immediately called Roger Wilson, the HOA president for the past decade, and a reasonable man I'd shared beers with on multiple occasions. "Roger, what's going on with this garage violation notice?" I asked. When he picked up, there was an uncomfortable pause on the line. "Yeah, Dan, I was afraid you'd be getting one of those. Patricia has been enthusiastic about enforcement since joining the board. She's found some language in the updated guidelines that technically gives the Architectural Committee authority to require modifications to existing structures. My garage has been here for 20 years, Roger. I'm not tearing it down because the new board member doesn't like the look of it." Roger sighed. "Look, I get it, but Patricia convinced a majority of the board to back her on this enforcement push. She's an attorney and knows how to work the language of the covenants. My suggestion? Come to the next board meeting and make your case. It's in 2 weeks. I thanked him and hung up, already planning my approach. The next day, I dug out the original approval documents for the garage from when the previous owners had built it. I also found the property survey showing that the garage was, in fact, precisely at the minimum setback required, not 4 inches too close as Patricia had claimed. Over the next week, I meticulously documented every aspect of my garage, taking measurements and photographs to disprove each of Patricia's claimed violations. I even found the original paint and gutter specifications, which matched exactly what the HOA had approved at the time. Then came the unexpected escalation. I returned home from work one afternoon to find a large orange notice taped to my garage door. In bold letters, "Structure scheduled for demolition. 60 days notice." The paper looked official, with the county seal at the top, but something seemed off about it. I immediately called the county building department. "No, sir, we haven't issued any demolition order for that address," the clerk confirmed after checking their records. "That's not even what our demolition notices look like. Someone might be playing a prank on you." It wasn't a prank. It was Patricia taking things to a disturbing new level. I removed the fake notice and installed a security camera aimed at my garage and driveway. That weekend, I was in my front yard pruning shrubs when Patricia marched up my driveway with a tape measure in hand. "Excuse me," I called out, setting down my pruning shears. "Can I help you with something?" She jumped slightly, clearly not expecting to be confronted. "I'm conducting an official measurement verification for the HOA records," she stated with authority. "On my private property without permission?" I kept my tone even despite my growing irritation. "As an HOA officer, I have the right to inspect potential violations," she countered. "Actually, you don't. The covenants clearly state that HOA officials must provide 24 hours written notice before entering any homeowner's property, and even then, only with permission. And while we're discussing violations, I'd like to ask about this." I pulled out the fake demolition notice from my pocket. Patricia's expression flickered between annoyance and something that looked surprisingly like satisfaction. "I don't know anything about that. Perhaps the county is finally addressing the eyesore you call a garage. That's interesting because the county confirmed they issued no such notice. Creating a fraudulent government document is actually a crime, Patricia, one that I've already reported to both the police and the county legal department." Her face paled slightly. "You're being ridiculous. If you'd simply comply with the architectural standards—" "I'd appreciate it if you'd leave my property now," I interrupted calmly. "Any future communications should be in writing or through the proper HOA channels. And Patricia, I've installed security cameras, so I'll know if you come back without permission." She left in a huff, but I knew this wouldn't be the end of it. That evening, I called my Uncle Frank for advice. I hadn't mentioned to anyone in the neighborhood that Frank Campbell was my mother's brother, and also the mayor of our small city. It wasn't something I generally brought up, as I preferred to make my own way without trading on family connections. But this situation was getting out of hand. A fake demolition notice? Uncle Frank's normally jovial voice turned serious. "That crosses several lines, Danny. Send me everything you have on this. The notices, your documentation, the security footage, everything. I'll have the city attorney take a look." I thanked him and sent over the files that night. Meanwhile, I prepared for the upcoming HOA board meeting, organizing my evidence into a clear, factual presentation. I also began talking to other neighbors, discovering I wasn't alone in receiving Patricia's special attention. The Johnsons had been cited for their children's treehouse, the Garcias for their vegetable garden boxes, and Mrs. Abernathy for a bird bath that had been in her yard for over 30 years. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and the community room at the local library was unusually crowded. Word had spread about the aggressive enforcement actions, and homeowners were concerned. I recognized nearly every face from the neighborhood, including several who had received violation notices of their own. Roger called the meeting to order, looking uncomfortable as he announced that the first agenda item was architectural compliance enforcement. Patricia stood up immediately, armed with a PowerPoint presentation showing photos of alleged violations throughout the neighborhood. My garage featured prominently in her examples of aesthetic degradation of community standards. "As you can see," she said, clicking to a slide with a particularly unflattering angle of my garage, "this structure violates multiple guidelines and creates a precedent that could decrease property values throughout Pinecrest Meadows. We must take firm action now before other homeowners think they can flout the rules." Roger thanked her for the presentation and then opened the floor for comments. I raised my hand and was recognized. "I'd like to address the specific allegations regarding my garage," I said, standing and walking to the front with my folder of documents. "First, I have here the original approval for the structure from 2001, signed by the HOA board at that time." I handed copies to each board member. "Second, I have verification from a licensed surveyor that the setback complies exactly with the requirements. Third, I have the original material and color specifications showing that every aspect of the garage was approved." I continued methodically through each alleged violation, providing evidence that disproved Patricia's claims. I could see several board members looking increasingly uncomfortable as I spoke. Finally, I concluded, "I'd like to address the fraudulent demolition notice that was placed on my property, purporting to be from the county." I held up the orange notice in a protective sleeve. "The county has confirmed this is a fake. Creating fraudulent government documents is a serious offense." Patricia interrupted, her voice sharp. "There's no proof of who placed that notice, and it's not relevant to the architectural violations." "Actually, it is," came a voice from the back of the room. Heads turned as Uncle Frank walked in, dressed not in his usual casual attire but in his official capacity as mayor, complete with the city lapel pin. He hadn't told me he was coming, and I was as surprised as everyone else. "Mayor Campbell," Roger said, clearly flustered. "We weren't expecting you. This is just a neighborhood HOA meeting." "Yes, well, when citizens are being harassed and fraudulent government documents are being distributed, it becomes a city concern," Uncle Frank replied. He walked to the front of the room. "For those who don't know me, I'm Frank Campbell, City Mayor. I've asked our city attorney to review the actions taken by this HOA board over the past 3 months, and what we've found is troubling." Patricia's face had gone from confident to concerned in seconds. "With all due respect, Mayor Campbell, this is an internal HOA matter. The city has no jurisdiction." "Actually, Miss Harrington, the city has very clear jurisdiction over fraudulent government documents, selective enforcement of covenants, and violations of state HOA governance laws." Uncle Frank's tone remained professional but firm. "Our review indicates that recent enforcement actions have not followed proper procedures, have targeted specific homeowners without consistent standards, and in some cases have misrepresented county and city requirements." He placed a folder on the table in front of the board. "This contains a formal request from the city attorney's office for all HOA enforcement records from the past 3 months. We're particularly interested in the approval process for these enforcement actions and any documentation of board votes authorizing them." The room was dead silent. Roger cleared his throat nervously. "Of course, Mayor Campbell, we will cooperate fully. I think there might have been some overzealousness in our recent enforcement efforts." "That's one way to put it," Uncle Frank replied. He then turned to address the room. For the homeowners present, I want to clarify that any notice claiming to be from the city or county should have official letterhead, a case number, and contact information for the issuing department. If you receive anything suspicious, please contact City Hall directly to verify its authenticity. Patricia stood up, her face flushed with anger. This is completely inappropriate. You're interfering with a private organization. She stopped abruptly, looking between Uncle Frank and me as realization dawned. Wait, Campbell? Calloway? Are you two related? Uncle Frank smiled slightly. Daniel is my nephew, yes. But I'm here today because multiple citizens have filed complaints about potentially illegal actions, not because of family ties. The city would be investigating regardless of who was involved. This isn't a conflict of interest. This is a conflict of interest, Patricia exclaimed, looking around for support but finding none. He's only doing this because his nephew complained. Miss Harrington, Uncle Frank continued calmly, the city has received complaints from 17 different homeowners in Pinecrest Meadows. The fact that my nephew is one of them doesn't change the validity of the concerns or the city's responsibility to address potentially illegal activities. Roger, seeing the meeting spiraling out of control, quickly called for a 10-minute recess. As people broke into small discussion groups, Patricia stormed out of the room, her face a mask of fury. 2 other board members followed her, while Roger and the remaining board member, a quiet woman named Ellen, who had always been friendly to me, stayed behind, looking deeply concerned. During the break, several neighbors came up to thank me for speaking out. Mrs. Abernathy patted my arm with tears in her eyes, telling me she had been so worried about having to remove her beloved bird bath. The Garcias showed me pictures of the violation notice for their vegetable garden, which cited unsightly agricultural activities as the reason they needed to remove the raised beds their children had helped build. When Roger called the meeting back to order, Patricia and her 2 allies were notably absent. Roger looked tired as he addressed the group. In light of the concerns raised tonight, the board is suspending all recent enforcement actions pending a full review. We'll be cooperating with the city's inquiry and will hold a special meeting in 2 weeks to discuss revisions to our enforcement procedures. He paused, then added, On behalf of the board, I apologize for any undue stress these actions have caused. That was never our intention. As the meeting adjourned, Uncle Frank pulled me aside. I didn't want to say this in front of everyone, but the city attorney is taking the fraudulent notice very seriously. We were able to pull fingerprints from it and have security camera footage from 3 houses on your street showing Patricia placing it on your garage. What happens now? She'll likely face charges for forgery and impersonating a government official, Uncle Frank explained. And based on what we've found so far, the HOA may have grounds to remove her from the board entirely. He clapped me on the shoulder. You did the right thing standing up to this, Danny. Too many people just pay unjust fines because they're afraid of conflict. Over the next few weeks, the situation unfolded rapidly. Patricia was asked to resign from the HOA board, which she did while maintaining she had done nothing wrong. The city attorney filed charges regarding the fraudulent demolition notice, and she eventually accepted a plea deal involving community service and probation. The HOA held a special election to replace the vacant board positions, and to everyone's surprise, I was nominated to fill one of them. Initially reluctant, I eventually agreed when Roger pointed out that the board needed people who understood the difference between reasonable oversight and harassment. My first action as a board member was to propose a homeowner's Bill of Rights, which clearly outlined the proper procedures for rule enforcement, required documentation and board votes for any violation notices, and established an appeals process for homeowners who felt they were unfairly targeted. It passed unanimously. Patricia listed her house for sale within a month. I saw her only once more after the fateful HOA meeting, as she was supervising movers loading a truck. Our eyes met briefly as I drove past, and I gave her a small civil nod. She looked away quickly. The neighborhood gradually returned to its former peaceful state. My garage, needless to say, remained exactly as it was, standing as a silent testament to the importance of standing up to bullies, even those armed with clipboards and rule books. Mrs. Abernathy's bird bath continued attracting cardinals and blue jays. The Garcia family's vegetable garden flourished, and the Johnson children's treehouse hosted countless adventures. Uncle Frank never let me forget that I'd initially been reluctant to mention our relationship. "Sometimes family connections come in handy, Danny," he'd say with a wink whenever the topic came up. "But I'm proud you tried to handle it on your own first." 6 months later, at the annual neighborhood barbecue, the same event where I'd first met Patricia, a new family who had bought her house approached me. They were a young couple with twin toddlers, looking slightly nervous as they introduced themselves. "We heard stories about the previous owner of our house," the husband said hesitantly. "We just wanted to assure everyone that we're not like that at all. We're just happy to be in such a nice neighborhood." "Don't worry," I told them with a smile. "Around here we judge people by how they treat their neighbors, not by how strictly they enforce arbitrary rules." Welcome to Pinecrest Meadows. Later that evening, as neighbors chatted and children played, Roger raised a toast to the most drama-free 6 months in HOA history. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. As for my infamous garage, I added window boxes with bright flowers beneath each window. A small, colorful act of celebration that definitely would have given Patricia heart palpitations. And whenever new neighbors moved in, they inevitably heard the story of the HOA Karen who tried to demolish my garage and didn't know the mayor was my uncle. Looking back, I'm still not a confrontational person, but I learned an important lesson through all of this. Sometimes standing up for what's right isn't about seeking conflict. It's about preventing those with power from abusing it. And that's a cause worth fighting for, even for the most peace-loving among us.